Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Thomas O'Brien found the teeth at 8,000 feet, arranged in a perfect circle around what used to be a person. Not all the teeth were human. That was the first thing his mind cataloged, the part of his brain that had earned him a master's in wildlife biology before he'd ever put on a ranger uniform. Molars, yes, human molars, 32 of them, placed with surgical precision in the alpine grass, but interspersed between them, canines too large, incisors too sharp, something that looked like it had come from a wolf but was the wrong color, wrong shape, wrong in ways Thomas couldn't articulate even with his vocabulary of taxonomic classification. The body, what remained of it, sat in the center. Thomas had seen bear attacks, had documented mountain lion kills, had written incident reports on exposure deaths and climbing accidents and one unfortunate encounter with a bull moose during rutting season. This was none of those things. The bones had been stripped clean, but not by scavengers. The flesh hadn't been torn. It had been removed with purpose, almost surgically. What little remained of the soft tissue showed signs of having been gnawed by human teeth. Thomas could see the distinctive pattern of human dental marks on what was left of a femur. His Garmin Montana 680 put him at exactly 7,987 feet elevation, 3 miles up the Iceberg Lake Trail. The coordinates matched where Olivia Rhodes's spot beacon had last transmitted 3 days ago. She'd been reported missing by her hiking partner, who'd become ill and turned back at the trailhead. Olivia had continued alone. Standard solo hike, experienced outdoors woman, all the right gear. Thomas keyed his radio, Motorola APX 4000, theoretically good for 20 miles line of sight. "Base, this is O'Brien. I need you to patch me through to the Flathead County Sheriff. We have a situation." Static. He was too high, too deep in the glacial cirque. The mountains blocked transmission. Thomas checked his phone, iPhone 6, supposedly the latest technology, but the single bar of service he'd had at the ranger station was long gone. He took photographs, documented everything, the teeth arrangement, the bones, the location. Then he noticed what else was wrong. It was July. At 8,000 feet in Glacier National Park, July meant wildflowers and meltwater and temperatures in the 60s, sometimes 70s. Thomas could see his breath. The grass around the body was rimmed with frost, delicate crystalline structures that shouldn't exist when the ambient temperature, he checked his thermometer, read 68 degrees. Localized phenomenon. Had to be. Cold air sinking from the glacier above, some meteorological quirk. Thomas's mind immediately began cataloging explanations even as something deeper, more primal, whispered that he was wrong. He circled the site, careful not to disturb potential evidence. That's when he saw the tracks. Human footprints, bare, pressed deep into the soil. Stride length approximately 6 feet. Whoever had made them was either running or had legs too long for a normal human gait. The prints led away from the body, heading higher up the trail toward Iceberg Lake, and beside them, carved into a piece of birch bark that shouldn't exist this high above tree line. Symbols. Not English, not any European language Thomas recognized. The curves and angles looked almost Native American, possibly Blackfeet. This was their ancestral land after all. But the arrangement was wrong, chaotic, like someone had carved them in a frenzy. Thomas photographed those too. Then he followed the tracks. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to mark the site, descend, get help. The part that had spent 6 years as a park ranger, that had pulled injured hikers off mountains and talked down suicide attempts at overlooks, told him that if Olivia Rhodes was still alive, if somehow this wasn't her in the center of that tooth circle, he had a duty to find her. The tracks led higher. The temperature dropped. Thomas zipped his North Face jacket, pulled on gloves, and kept climbing. Iceberg Lake Trail was supposed to be spectacular. Wildflowers in July, glacier-fed lake so blue it looked artificial, mountain goats on the cliffs above. Thomas had hiked it dozens of times. led naturalist walks, given talks about the geology and ecology. He knew every switchback, every overlook, every place where pikas nested in the talus slopes. He didn't recognize this trail. The vegetation was wrong, stunted. Alpine firs that should have been vibrant with new growth looked desiccated, as if winter had never released its grip. Wildflowers lay withered in patches of frost. Even the lichens on the rocks looked gray, lifeless. And it was so quiet. No marmots whistling warnings, no birds, not even the sound of insects. Just Thomas's breathing, growing labored in the thin air, and the crunch of frost under his Salomon hiking boots. At the overlook point, where tourists usually stop to photograph the lake still a mile ahead, Thomas found the second body, or what was becoming a second body. The woman sat cross-legged on a flat boulder facing the glacier. She was naked, her clothes torn and scattered around her like she'd shed them in haste. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over bones that jutted at angles that suggested malnutrition, but her stomach was distended, swollen, like advanced starvation or pregnancy. She was eating. Thomas's gorge rose as he realized what she held in her hands. A human arm, partially consumed, the hand still intact enough that he could see the fingernails painted purple. Olivia Rhodes' missing person report had mentioned purple nail polish, a detail her hiking partner remembered because they'd joked about it, about wearing polish on a backpacking trip. "Ma'am?" Thomas's voice came out strangled. "Olivia Rhodes." The woman's head turned. Not her body, just her head, rotating with a flexibility that no human cervical spine should allow. Her eyes were wrong. Too large, too dark. All pupil with just a thin ring of white around the edges. Her mouth was smeared with blood, and when she smiled, Thomas saw that her teeth were different. Longer, sharper. "So hungry," she whispered. Her voice sounded like wind through dead trees. So hungry, always hungry, never full. Thomas's hand went to his bear spray, then stopped. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't anything he'd been trained for. His mind raced through explanations. Psychotic break, drugs, some kind of prion disease like what happened to the cannibals in Papua New Guinea. But none of them explained the teeth, the eyes, the impossible angle of her neck. "Olivia, my name is Ranger Thomas O'Brien. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what happened? Wendigo." The word came from behind him. Thomas spun. An old man stood on the trail, though Thomas hadn't heard him approach. He was Native American, Blackfeet. Thomas guessed from the region, wearing modern hiking clothes but carrying a bundle wrapped in what looked like deer hide. His face was deeply lined, weathered by decades of mountain weather, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "That's Algonquian," Thomas said automatically. "This is Blackfeet territory." "Wrong." He stopped himself. "You shouldn't be here. This is a crime scene." "No." The old man shook his head. "This is a hunting ground. Has been for longer than your parks, longer than your maps. The Wendigo hunts here." The woman, Olivia, made a sound that might have been laughter or sobbing. She returned to eating, tearing at the flesh with teeth that definitely hadn't been in her mouth when she'd started this hike. "That's not..." Thomas struggled for words. "That's a legend. Folklore. There's no such thing as..." "You're looking at it." The old man moved closer, but not too close. "She violated the taboo, ate human flesh. Now she's transforming. By tomorrow, maybe tonight, she won't be human anymore. Just hunger. Endless hunger in the shape of something that used to be a person." Thomas's scientific training warred with what he was seeing. "She's suffering from exposure and delirium, possibly hypothermia-induced psychosis combined with extreme malnutrition leading to her eating her hiking partner's arm." The old man's voice was gentle, pitying. "Ranger, how long have you worked these mountains?" 6 years. I've walked them for 70. My grandfather walked them for 80 before me. His grandfather before him. We know what lives here. What hunts when winter comes too early, when the cold settles into your bones and the hunger becomes so strong you do anything to fill it. Olivia stood. The movement was wrong, joints bending in ways that made Thomas's stomach clench. She dropped the arm. It landed with a wet sound that would haunt his dreams and began walking toward them. "So hungry," she whispered again. "You smell warm, warm and full. Share, please share." The old man unwrapped his bundle. Inside, dried herbs that Thomas didn't recognize, a knife made of obsidian and what looked like bones carved with symbols. "My name is Henry Runningcrane," the old man said, still in that gentle voice that suggested he was explaining something to a child. "I'm what you might call a medicine man, though that's a white word for something more complex. My family has been hunting wendigos for 7 generations. This is the 3rd I've tracked to Glacier. This is insane." But Thomas's hand was shaking as he pulled out his own knife. Bench-made bushcrafter 4-inch blade meant for clearing trail and processing firewood, not for whatever this was becoming. "She needs medical help, psychiatric evaluation. She needs mercy." Henry began walking a circle around them, dropping pinches of the dried herbs. Where they fell, the frost receded slightly. "And you need to decide, Ranger. You can keep trying to explain this with your science, or you can help me save whatever's left of her soul." Olivia, the thing Olivia was becoming, lunged. Thomas's training took over. He sidestepped, muscle memory from defensive tactics courses, and she stumbled past him. But when she recovered, the movement was too fast, too fluid. No human moved like that. She came at him again, and this time Henry was there, the obsidian knife flashing. Not to kill. The blade traced symbols in the air, and where it passed, Olivia flinched back as if struck. "The Wendigo is spirit and flesh," Henry said, his voice steady even as he moved with a precision that belied his age. "Fighting the flesh does nothing. You have to fight the spirit." He began to chant. Not in English, not in any language Thomas knew. The words had a rhythm that seemed to match the pulse Thomas could feel in his temples, in his chest. And as Henry chanted, Olivia screamed. It wasn't a human sound. It was the cry of something starving, something that had been hungry for so long that hunger had become its entire existence. The sound echoed off the mountains, and Thomas heard other sounds answer from higher up the trail. From the glacier. From the peaks. How many? How many people had come to these mountains and never come back? How many missing hikers and presumed accidents were actually this transformation into something that existed in the space between folklore and nightmare? "Help me!" Olivia's voice broke through the Wendigo's cry. For just a moment, Thomas saw the woman in the hiking report. College student, 22, environmental science major, wanted to see the glaciers before they melted. "Please, it hurts. I'm so hungry. I didn't want to, but I was so hungry." Thomas made a decision that violated every regulation, every protocol, every piece of training he'd ever received. He stepped into Henry's circle. "Tell me what to do." Henry's eyes met his, and Thomas saw respect there and sadness. "Hold her. Keep her still. This will hurt her, but it's the only way." Thomas had restrained violent individuals before. Drunk tourists, people in mental health crises, but Olivia fought with strength that shouldn't exist in a body that looked half-starved. Her fingers, no, claws. When had they become claws? Tore at his jacket, leaving gouges in the North Face fabric that should have been impossible. Henry pressed symbols carved into bone against her forehead, her chest, her palms. Where they touched, her skin blistered, smoking in the cold air. She screamed, and Thomas held on, his rational mind completely shattered, operating on pure instinct and a desperate hope that the old man knew what he was doing. The temperature dropped further. Thomas could see ice forming on Olivia's skin, in her hair. Henry's chanting grew louder, more urgent, and suddenly Thomas understood. He was seeing the spirit. The Wendigo, a shadow that overlaid Olivia's body, skeletal and massive, antlers sprouting from a skull that was part deer and part human, and part something else entirely. Eyes like frozen lakes reflecting nothing. Mouth open in an eternal howl of hunger. "It's already too far," Henry said, and his voice broke. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. She's too far gone." "No." Thomas tightened his grip. There has to be something. The only thing left is to free her, before she becomes fully Wendigo. Before she loses everything that made her human. You mean kill her? I mean grant her mercy before she kills and transforms others. Olivia, what was left of Olivia, looked at Thomas with eyes that were mostly Wendigo now, but still held a spark of human awareness. Please, she whispered. I don't want to be hungry anymore. Thomas had never killed anything larger than the injured elk he'd had to put down last winter, and that had haunted him for weeks. But he looked at Olivia Rhodes, college student who'd wanted to see glaciers, and saw that Henry was right. Whatever was happening to her was worse than death. How? His voice was steady despite the tears freezing on his cheeks. Henry handed him the obsidian knife. Through the heart. The spirit knife will cut both flesh and Wendigo. Make it quick. Thomas took the knife. It was surprisingly light, edges sharp enough that he could feel them through his gloves. Olivia tilted her head back, exposing her throat, her chest, offering herself. Thank you, she said. Thank you for not letting me become... Thomas drove the blade home before he could think about it, before rationalization and doubt could stop him. The obsidian slid through her sternum as if her bones were made of ice, and Olivia gasped once, a sound of relief rather than pain. The Wendigo shadow screamed and thrashed, trying to hold on to her. But Henry's chanting intensified, and the herbs he'd scattered began to smoke. The spirit pulled away, dissolving into the cold air, leaving only Olivia's body cradled in Thomas's arms. She looked peaceful, human. The distension in her stomach had vanished. Her teeth were normal. She looked like she was sleeping. Thomas held her as the warmth left her body, as Henry finished his prayers, as the sun dropped toward the western peaks and cast everything in shades of gold and red. The other body, Thomas finally said. The one with the teeth in a circle. Her hiking partner, Kyle Morrison. He turned completely, became full Wendigo. Henry gestured higher up the trail. He's up there, in the glacier. I tracked him for 3 days before I tracked her. You killed him. I sent him on. Yes. Thomas looked at the body in his arms, looked at his hands still holding the obsidian knife, still covered in blood that was steaming in the cold air. I just committed murder. You committed mercy. I'm a park ranger. I enforce federal law. Thomas stopped, started again. How do I report this? How do I explain any of this? Henry began gathering his things, wrapping the knife and bones and herbs back in their deer hide. You tell the truth. That you found Olivia Rhodes deceased from exposure and malnutrition. That she'd suffered a severe psychotic break, probably induced by hypothermia. That she'd engaged in post-mortem cannibalism on her hiking partner's body due to extreme starvation. It's documented in survival situations won't raise too many questions. That by the time you found her, it was too late to save her. And Kyle Morrison? Bear attack. Probably the same bear that led to Olivia's psychological break. Very tragic. These things happen in the wilderness. It was all lies. All of it. But Thomas looked at the obsidian knife still in his hand, at the frost that was already creeping back now that Henry's herbs had stopped smoking, at the mountains that suddenly felt ancient and full of things his education had never prepared him for. The Wendigo, he said. Are there more? Always. Henry shouldered his pack. Every winter, every time someone gets too hungry, too desperate, and crosses the line. The taboo exists for a reason. Not all of them become full Wendigo. Most die first, thank the Creator. But some survive long enough to transform. And then they hunt until someone like me stops them. Why didn't you warn people? Put up signs. Tell the Park Service. Would you have believed me? Henry's smile was sad. You're an educated man, Ranger O'Brien. Master's degree. 6 years of experience. You didn't believe until you saw. Until you held her. Would a sign that said beware of Wendigos have done anything except made people laugh? Thomas had no answer to that. Henry started down the trail, then paused. You'll see it now. The cold spots in summer. the places where nothing grows, the missing hikers who don't fit the usual patterns. You'll understand what the old stories are really warning about, and you'll have a choice. Keep explaining it away or accept that there are things in these mountains older and stranger than your science accounts for. I'm a ranger, Thomas said. I'm supposed to protect people. Then protect them. Just know that sometimes protection requires methods the Park Service manual doesn't cover. Henry disappeared down the trail, and Thomas was alone with Olivia's body and a knife made of volcanic glass, and the growing understanding that everything he thought he knew about the natural world was incomplete. It took him 4 hours to carry her down. By the time he reached the trailhead where other rangers and the county sheriff were waiting, he'd constructed a plausible story. Exposure, hypothermia, psychotic break leading to cannibalism of deceased hiking partner. Bear attack on partner. Solo hiker found too late to save. They believed him. Why wouldn't they? Thomas O'Brien was known for his rationality, his scientific approach, his detailed reports. If he said it was exposure and bears, it was exposure and bears. The investigation took 2 weeks, closed the trail for 5 days. Helicoptered in a bear management team that found and killed a grizzly with human remains in its stomach. Thomas tried not to think about how convenient that was, how the old medicine man might have arranged it. The official report cited multiple factors: inadequate preparation, solo hiking in remote terrain, unfortunate encounter with wildlife, exposure leading to impaired judgment. Thomas signed off on all of it, filed his reports, gave his statements, and never mentioned obsidian knives or Wendigo spirits or medicine men who hunted things that shouldn't exist. But he kept the knife. Henry had left it with him, wrapped in deer hide, with a note. You'll need this eventually. They always come back. 3 months later, in October, when the first real snows came to Glacier, Thomas got a call about a missing hunter on the North Ridge. The man's friends reported he'd been acting strangely the day before he vanished, complaining of hunger even after eating, talking about cold spots in the forest, hearing voices calling him higher into the mountains. Thomas requested the assignment, packed his gear, added the deer hide bundle to his emergency kit, tucked in with the first aid supplies and storm gear. The ranger station supervisor asked if he wanted backup. Thomas said no. Some things you had to face alone. Some things required tools that couldn't be explained in an incident report. He found the hunter at 9,000 feet already changing, eyes going dark and teeth beginning to shift. Thomas used the obsidian knife, said the prayers Henry had taught him, made it quick and as merciful as he could. The official report cited another bear attack. The hunter's family got closure. The mountains kept their secrets. And Thomas O'Brien, who had spent 6 years believing that science could explain everything, learned to recognize the signs. The cold in summer, the hunger that nothing could fill. The moment when a person stopped being human and became something else, something that lived between legend and reality. He never spoke to Henry Running Crane again, but sometimes he found offerings on the trail, dried herbs, carved bones, small acknowledgments from someone who knew that Thomas was keeping watch now, protecting hikers from threats the Park Service manual couldn't account for. On his days off, Thomas read, not his old biology texts, but anthropology papers on Algonquian mythology, Blackfeet oral histories, academic analyses of taboo behaviors across cultures. He learned that the Wendigo existed in many forms, under many names, wherever humans pushed into territories they weren't meant to occupy without proper respect. And he understood finally that the forests held more than trees and wildlife. They held memory, held spirits, held consequences for those who forgot that nature wasn't just backdrop for human recreation, but a living system with rules older and stranger than federal regulation. Thomas O'Brien never stopped being a ranger, never stopped believing in science and evidence and rational explanation. But he added another layer to his understanding, a recognition that some truths lived in the space between explanation and experience, in the places where folklore and reality overlapped. And when the cold came early, when the frost appeared in July, when hikers went missing with that particular wrongness that meant they'd crossed a line they shouldn't have crossed, Thomas packed his gear, grabbed the deer hide bundle, and went hunting. Not for bears. Not for natural threats. For the hungry things that wore human shapes until hunger consumed everything else. For the wendigos that proved some legends existed for reasons no laboratory could measure. And sometimes, late at night in his cabin, Thomas thought about Olivia Rhodes, about her purple nail polish and environmental science degree and the moment she'd looked at him with human eyes and begged for mercy. He thought about the obsidian knife and Henry Running Crane's sad smile and the realization that protecting people sometimes meant doing things that couldn't be written in reports. The mountains remembered. The forests remembered. And now Thomas remembered too. He kept watch, and when the cold came early, he was ready. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The trail camera captured frame 2847 at 11:43 p.m. Empty desert. Frame 2848 at 11:43 p.m. 7 figures standing motionless, facing the lens. Lisa Hoffman cycled through the images 3 times on her laptop screen, searching for the glitch that would explain the impossibility. Motion-activated Reckonix trail cameras didn't malfunction like this. She'd set up hundreds across her 7 years as a wildlife biologist with the National Park Service, documented everything from mountain lions to illegal ATV traffic, and never once had she seen a frame where human figures simply materialized between 1 second and the next, in a location she'd personally verified was empty when she'd installed the camera 6 days ago. The figures weren't blurred by movement, weren't partially visible at frame edges suggesting they'd walked into shot. They were simply there, 7 adults standing in a rough semicircle 20 feet from the camera, their postures identical, arms at sides, heads tilted at the same 15-degree angle, faces catching the infrared flash in a way that made their features seem flat, featureless, like masks of human skin stretched over something that didn't quite understand facial structure. Lisa zoomed in on the nearest figure, the image pixelated but retained enough detail to make her stomach turn. The person, if it was a person, wore hiking clothes that looked wrong, as if someone had dressed a mannequin based on description rather than observation. The boots were on the correct feet but unlaced. The shirt was buttoned but the buttons were in the wrong holes. And the hands hung too low, knuckles almost brushing knees, proportions that suggested the arms contained an extra joint somewhere between elbow and wrist. Equipment failure, Lisa said aloud to her empty ranger station office, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a career on measurable data and peer-reviewed methodology. Sensor malfunction creating composite image from multiple frames, memory card corruption, something explainable. But the metadata was clean, single frame, captured at 11:43:17 p.m. on August 4, 2013, exposure and focus both within normal parameters. And frame 2849, captured 1 second later, showed the semicircle empty again, just desert sand and creosote bushes, and the red sandstone wall of the canyon beyond. Lisa pulled up the incident report that had prompted her to review the camera footage. Connor Burke, 32, experienced desert hiker from Moab, had filed a permit for a 4-day solo backpacking trip through the Needles district of Canyonlands National Park. His vehicle was found 3 days past his expected return date at the Elephant Hill trailhead, keys in the ignition, wallet and phone on the dashboard, like he'd stepped out intending to come right back, and simply never did. The trail camera was positioned at mile marker 8 along his planned route, a junction where the Chesler Park Trail intersected with the Joint Trail through a narrow slot canyon. If Connor had followed his permit, he'd have passed the camera on his second day out, but there was no footage of him, just that single impossible frame of 7 figures who appeared and vanished like they'd been edited into reality itself. Lisa had seen the missing person posters around Moab, the Facebook groups demanding answers, the conspiracy theorists suggesting everything from alien abduction to government cover-up. She'd dismissed it all with the casual contempt of someone who dealt in facts, who understood that people got lost in wilderness through mundane failures of preparation and judgment, not supernatural intervention. The desert killed through dehydration, Heat stroke, falls in slot canyons, rattlesnake bites, all statistically documented, all explainable. What the desert didn't do was make 7 people materialize and dematerialize on trail cameras, while leaving 0 physical evidence of their presence. Lisa exported the images to her phone, grabbed her field pack, and headed for the trailhead. It was 6 a.m., early enough to hike 8 miles before the August heat became dangerous, late enough that she'd have full daylight to examine the camera site. She'd find the rational explanation. Teenage pranksters, tribal members conducting ceremonies they didn't want documented, even art installation by someone making a statement about surveillance. Something that didn't require abandoning the epistemological framework that had guided her through undergraduate at UC Davis, master's at Colorado State, and 7 years of professional field biology. The Needles District earned its name from the red and white sandstone spires that jutted from the earth like teeth, erosion carving the landscape into a maze of canyons, arches, and narrow passages that could disorient even experienced navigators. Lisa had worked this section of canyon lands for 3 years, knew the trails well enough to hike them in her sleep, had published 2 papers on desert bighorn sheep population dynamics, using data collected from these exact canyons. She passed the 4-mile marker at 7:30, the temperature already climbing toward 90. Her Garmin GPS showed she was precisely en route, following Connor Burke's planned path with the methodical precision that made her valuable to the NPS. At mile 6, she found the first anomaly, boot prints in the sand that started mid-stride, as if the person making them had dropped from the sky. She photographed them with her phone, noted the size, men's 10, consistent with Connor Burke's equipment list, and followed their direction. The prints led toward the canyon wall, then stopped. Not at the wall, but 3 feet before it, in open sand. Lisa circled the area, searching for where the trail resumed, and found nothing. Just those impossible prints, beginning nowhere and ending nowhere, violating the basic principle that footprints required continuous contact between feet and ground. She pulled out her field notebook and documented the observation, her handwriting precise despite the unease building in her chest. Arrow 7:45 hours. Mile 6.2. Discovered discontinuous track evidence, consistent with missing hiker Burke. Size 10 hiking boot. Track origin point shows no approach indicators. Terminus shows no departure indicators. Possible explanations: wind erosion, unlikely given depth and definition. Animal disturbance, no paw prints present. Human fabrication for unknown purpose. The sun climbed higher. Lisa's water consumption increased. And the desert, which she'd always understood as hostile but comprehensible, began revealing patterns that violated her understanding of how physical space worked. At mile 7, she found another camera, not hers, older model, the kind serious wildlife photographers used. It was mounted to a juniper tree. Lens pointed toward a game trail bighorn sheep used to access a seep spring. Lisa checked the memory card and found it full. 8,000 images spanning 3 weeks. She scrolled through them rapidly on the camera's display screen, watching the usual parade of wildlife: mule deer, coyotes, ravens, the occasional bighorn. Then, starting 2 weeks ago, the pattern changed. Every image captured after sunset showed the same thing: figures in the background, barely visible, standing motionless in positions that suggested they'd been there for hours. As the days progressed, the figures moved closer to the camera, their numbers increasing. 2, then 4, then 6, then 12, until the final images showed nothing but bodies pressed against the lens, faces filling the frame with that same flat, mask-like quality Lisa had seen in her own camera's footage. The timestamp on the final image was August 4th at 11:43 p.m., the same moment her camera had captured the 7 figures. As if whatever these things were had moved between locations instantaneously, been photographed simultaneously by cameras 8 miles apart. Lisa's rational mind offered explanations: coordinated prank, multiple people working together, clever editing. But her body, the part of her that evolution had tuned to recognize predators and threats, understood something her intellect refused to accept. She was being hunted, had been since she entered the Needles. Maybe since she'd reviewed that first impossible frame and decided to investigate rather than file it as equipment malfunction and move on. She continued toward mile marker 8, her hand resting on the bear spray at her hip, despite knowing that whatever she was dealing with wouldn't be deterred by capsaicin. The slot canyon that led to the camera site narrowed progressively, red sandstone walls rising 50 feet on either side. The sky reduced to a ribbon of blue overhead. In the confined space, sounds echoed strangely. Her footsteps seemed to come from ahead and behind simultaneously, creating the illusion of company where she knew she was alone. The trail camera was exactly where she'd mounted it 6 days ago, still secured to its anchor bolt in the sandstone. But the camera itself had been opened, the memory card removed and placed carefully on the ground beside it. And written in the sand beneath the camera, in letters formed by what looked like finger dragging, was a message in a language Lisa didn't know but somehow understood anyway. You don't believe. Good. Easier when they don't believe. Lisa's skepticism, her armor of scientific methodology and empirical evidence cracked. Not broken, she wasn't ready to abandon rationality, but fissured, letting in the possibility that reality contained more than her education had prepared her for. She photographed the message, collected the memory card, and turned to retrace her route back to the trailhead. Connor Burke stood blocking the canyon. Lisa's breath caught. She knew it wasn't actually Connor, had never seen him in person, only photos from the missing person report, but the resemblance was perfect. Same height, same build, same sun-bleached hair and sun-darkened skin. He wore hiking clothes identical to what his gear list specified. Blue synthetic shirt, khaki pants, Vasque boots. Even his posture matched the confident stance of someone comfortable in wilderness. But when he spoke, multiple voices emerged, his own layered with others, men and women and children, dozens of voices speaking in unison. You're the scientist, the one who measures everything, the one who thinks counting sheep makes you understand the desert. Lisa's hand moved to her radio, muscle memory overriding the surreal horror of the moment. This is Ranger Hoffman requesting immediate assistance at... The thing wearing Connor Burke's face smiled, and the smile was wrong, the lips pulling back too far, revealing teeth that were human-shaped but the wrong color, wrong texture, like they'd been carved from sandstone rather than grown from calcium. Radio won't work. We're not where you think you are. Not when you are. Time runs different in the spaces between places. Lisa pressed the transmit button anyway. Static answered, but underneath the static she heard voices, her own voice, repeated hundreds of times, all saying, requesting immediate assistance, in slightly different tones as if she'd been trapped here making the same call for hours or days or years. She ran, not back toward the trailhead. The thing blocked that direction, but deeper into the slot canyon, toward the technical section where the walls narrowed to shoulder width and required sideways shuffling to navigate. Behind her, footsteps that didn't sound like footsteps, more like something with too many joints trying to approximate human locomotion. The canyon twisted, branched again. Lisa had mapped these passages, knew the route that led to Chesler Park and from there to multiple exit points. But the landmarks were wrong. Arches appeared in walls where no arches should exist. Side canyons opened onto vistas that showed desert stretching to horizons in directions that didn't correspond to any geography she'd studied. She emerged into a chamber she'd never seen despite 3 years working these canyons. A circular space 50 feet across, walls carved with petroglyphs that looked ancient but showed modern figures. People with cameras, people with phones, people with the equipment of 21st century tourists. And in the center of the chamber, arranged in that same semicircle from the trail camera footage, 7 bodies lay in the sand. Not dead. Not exactly. Their chests rose and fell with respiration, but their eyes were open and empty, their faces slack, their bodies positioned with that same identical posture Lisa had seen in the photographs. And she recognized 2 of them from missing person reports, hikers who'd vanished in canyonlands over the past year. Their cases unsolved, their bodies never recovered because they'd been here, in this place that existed in the desert, but not quite of it. Connor Burke was the 3rd body. Lisa knelt beside him, checked his pulse, thready but present. His skin was cool despite the desert heat, his pupils responsive to light but tracking nothing. Whatever had happened to him, it had left his body functioning but taken something essential, some quality that separated living human from biological machine going through motions without consciousness. "They walk between shapes," a voice said behind her, and Lisa spun to find an elderly Navajo woman sitting on a boulder at the chamber's edge, her presence so natural, it was like she'd always been there and Lisa had only just noticed. That's what Yinald Lushi means, the ones who walk on all fours. But it's not about four legs. It's about wearing different skins, being one thing and another thing, existing in spaces that aren't quite here or there. Lisa's skepticism surged back, reflexive and defensive. That's folklore, skinwalker legends, cultural stories, not what? Not real? The woman's expression held pity rather than anger. You measure the world in numbers, biologist. Count the sheep, track the predators, write your papers about population dynamics. But some things can't be counted because they're never quite present enough to measure. They exist in the gaps between observations, in the spaces your science doesn't acknowledge. Science acknowledges everything that can be empirically verified, Lisa said, hearing how absurd the words sounded in a chamber that shouldn't exist, surrounded by comatose hikers who'd been missing for months. If something exists, it leaves evidence. They leave evidence. You're standing in it. The woman gestured at the bodies, the petroglyphs, the canyon itself. Every year, people vanish in the desert. You write reports attributing it to exposure, dehydration, falls. But some of them end here, in places your maps don't show, taken by things that learned to walk upright when your ancestors were still in trees. They wear faces to hunt, biologists. They wear voices. They wear the shapes that let them get close to prey before the prey understands it's being hunted. Lisa wanted to argue, to demand evidence that met scientific standards, to maintain the epistemological boundaries that separated rational understanding from superstitious nonsense. But 7 bodies lay at her feet, including a man who'd been missing for 8 days, and her GPS showed she was simultaneously at mile marker 8 and nowhere, that corresponded to any mapped coordinates, the device flickering between readings like it couldn't decide which reality to report. "How do I get them out?" Lisa asked, pragmatism overriding philosophy. "These people have families. They need medical attention. I need to." "You can't take them. They're not fully here anymore. The Yinald Lushi took something when it took their shapes. Memory, maybe. Or the part that knows how to be human rather than just look human. They're anchors now, holding the spaces open between what is and what else might be." "That's not acceptable." Lisa's voice carried the authority of federal law enforcement, the weight of institutional power, the conviction that humans with radios and helicopters and search and rescue teams could impose order on wilderness. "I'm calling for medical evacuation. I'm bringing them home." The old woman shook her head slowly. "You still don't understand. There is no home for them anymore. The thing wearing their shapes took that. And it's wearing your friend's shape right now, walking around Moab asking about you, learning your pattern so it can wear you too when the time comes." Connor Burke's body, the real Connor, comatose in the sand, suddenly convulsed, his back arching, his mouth opening to release a sound that wasn't quite human scream or animal cry, but something that contained both and something else. Besides, something that suggested vocal cords designed for language humans never developed. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying, until it seemed like hundreds of voices were screaming in unison from the stone itself. The other 6 bodies answered, their own voices joining the chorus, and in that moment Lisa understood what the old woman meant about shapes and skins and spaces between. These people weren't prisoners or victims in any conventional sense. They were batteries, their life force siphoned to maintain whatever impossible geometry allowed this chamber to exist outside normal space-time. Their consciousness used as fuel to power the Yinald Lushi's ability to walk between worlds. "You're saying Connor Burke, the real Connor, is gone?" Lisa heard herself ask, medical training warring with the impossibility she was being asked to accept. "His body's here, but some skinwalker is walking around wearing his identity. Not just identity, memory, personality. Everything that made him him, copied perfectly because they've had millennia to learn how humans work. Your friend's family won't know the difference. His co-workers won't. His girlfriend won't. Only when it's hungry will the mask slip, will the thing underneath show through. And by then it'll be too late because it'll have gotten close to someone else, learned them well enough to take their shape when it's done feeding. Lisa's mind raced through the implications. If what the old woman said was true, and the evidence surrounding her suggested it was, then Connor Burke's family was currently mourning a man who was simultaneously comatose in an impossible canyon and walking around impersonating their loved one. And if there were 7 bodies here, 7 people who'd vanished in Canyonlands over the past 2 years, then there were potentially 7 skinwalkers wearing their shapes, integrated into their communities, waiting for opportunities to hunt. This is happening all over, Lisa said slowly, puzzle pieces clicking into place. The missing person statistics for Canyonlands are higher than any comparable park, not because the terrain is more dangerous, but because this is thin place, the woman finished, where the boundaries between worlds wear down. The Navajo know to avoid these canyons when the heat does strange things to the air, when the light bends wrong, when the tracks appear that don't connect to anything. But tourists don't know. Scientists don't know. So they walk into places like this and the Yinald Lushi take them, wear them, use them to take more. Lisa's radio suddenly crackled with her own voice. Hoffman to base, requesting immediate assistance. I've found Burke. He's alive but unresponsive. Need medical evacuation at... The voice cut off mid-sentence, replaced by Connor Burke's voice. Forget what you saw, Lisa. Chalk it up to heat stroke. Write it off as hallucination. Go back to counting sheep and pretending the world is measurable. Then a third voice, one Lisa didn't recognize. She won't forget. She's too curious, too arrogant in her certainty that science explains everything. She'll investigate, she'll document, and when she does, we'll add her to the collection. The radio died. The old woman stood, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints protested, but whose will remained undiminished. You have a choice, biologist. Accept that your understanding of reality is incomplete, that your measurements miss what's most important, that the desert contains things your science can't acknowledge. Or maintain your skepticism, file your reports about equipment malfunction and missing hikers, and wait for the night when something wearing a face you trust comes to take your shape. Those aren't choices, Lisa protested. Those are threats dressed up as wisdom. If skinwalkers are real, if this... She gestured at the chamber, the bodies, the impossible geography, is actually happening, then we need to respond with force. Get tribal authorities involved, FBI if it's crossing reservation boundaries, bring in specialists who what? Who measure? Who document? Who apply scientific method to things that exist specifically in the spaces science doesn't examine? The woman's laugh was bitter. You think you're the first educated person to stumble into this? Every few years, someone like you finds these places, sees what's really happening, and decides institutional power can solve it. Then they file reports that get dismissed, conduct investigations that find nothing, bring in experts who chalk it up to mass hysteria or environmental toxins or anything that fits existing frameworks. Because accepting the truth means accepting that human understanding is fundamentally limited, that we're not the apex predators we like to believe, that the world is stranger and more hostile than our civilizations acknowledge. Lisa wanted to argue, but the evidence surrounded her in ways that scientific methodology couldn't dispute. She'd found bodies. She'd documented impossible photographs. She'd watched her GPS give contradictory readings and heard voices emerge from her radio that shouldn't exist. At some point, maintaining skepticism became its own form of delusion, a refusal to acknowledge data simply because it violated her theoretical framework. What do I do? Lisa asked, the question costing her more than she'd expected, requiring admission that her education and experience were insufficient for the situation she'd encountered. You learn. You listen to the people whose ancestors have survived alongside these things for millennia. You stop dismissing tribal knowledge as folklore and start recognizing it as empirical observation accumulated across generations. And you protect yourself because now that you've seen this place, now that you know what's possible, the Yinald Lushi will come for you. Maybe tonight, maybe next month, but eventually, they can't let you leave knowing what you know. The old woman produced something from a pouch at her waist, a small bundle of herbs bound with red string, reeking of sage, and something else Lisa couldn't identify. Carry this. It won't stop them, but it'll make you harder to track between worlds, harder to pin down long enough to take your shape, and stay in groups. They hunt best when people are isolated, when there's no one to verify reality, when belief can be manipulated. Lisa accepted the bundle with hands that trembled despite her best efforts at control. And Connor? The others? What happens to them? They stay here, in this place that's barely a place, keeping the doorway open. That's their purpose now. That's what they gave up when they walked into canyons that bend wrong and ignored the feeling that said turn back. The woman moved toward a passage Lisa was certain hadn't existed moments ago. A gap in the sandstone that seemed to ripple like liquid stone. You should leave too, before the sun sets and the spaces get wider, before more of them come to see what caught their attention. Lisa looked at the 7 bodies one final time. Connor Burke's face was peaceful, almost serene, no indication of the horror his consciousness might be experiencing if any consciousness remained. She wanted to stay, to attempt evacuation, to apply the institutional resources she'd spent 7 years learning to deploy. But the old woman was right. Whatever these people had become, they were beyond her ability to save with helicopters and medical teams. She followed the woman through the rippling passage, her GPS screaming confusion, her radio cycling through voices that might have been other rangers or might have been something else wearing ranger frequency. The passage twisted, narrowed, and suddenly Lisa was standing at the mouth of the Joint Trail Slot Canyon, the sun overhead indicating no time had passed, despite her sense that she'd been in that impossible chamber for hours. The old woman was gone. The passage behind Lisa showed only solid sandstone. No gap or door or indication that anything existed beyond surface reality, and when Lisa checked her GPS, it showed mile marker 8, exactly where her trail camera was mounted, exactly where she should be according to the laws of geography and map-making. She hiked back to the trailhead in a daze, her mind processing what she'd seen against the framework of what she'd believed about how the world worked. By the time she reached her vehicle, the cognitive dissonance had crystallized into something harder. Determination. If skinwalkers were real, if they were hunting in canyon lands using the shapes of their victims, then Lisa's response couldn't be to dismiss or ignore or file reports that would be disbelieved. Her response had to be documentation, evidence gathering, building a case so thorough that institutional power would be forced to acknowledge what she'd found. Over the following weeks, Lisa became obsessive. She pulled missing person reports going back a decade, correlated them with lunar phases and seasonal patterns, identified clusters that suggested coordinated hunting rather than random wilderness mortality. She reviewed footage from every trail camera in Canyonlands, finding dozens of images similar to her own, figures that appeared between frames, groups that watched cameras with that same flat, mask-like quality. She interviewed tribal members, approached respectfully this time, listened to stories she'd previously dismissed as cultural narrative rather than empirical observation. The patterns emerged. Yinald Lushi hunting during new moons, targeting solo hikers who displayed arrogance or disrespect toward the land, taking shapes and wearing them for months or years before discarding them for fresh victims. But when Lisa presented her findings to the superintendent, when she laid out the evidence in careful detail with photographs and witness statements and statistical analysis, the response was exactly what the old woman had predicted. Sympathetic concern about heat stress, suggestions she take leave to recover from the trauma of searching for Connor Burke, gentle implications that her objectivity had been compromised by isolation and fear. Lisa realized then that institutional power couldn't address what she'd found, because institutions were built on consensus reality, on shared agreement about what was possible. Skinwalkers existed in the gaps of that consensus, in the spaces where belief wavered and certainty fractured. Fighting them required different tools than what her biology degree and federal badge provided. She started spending time with tribal consultants, learning protective practices and recognition signs. She modified her trail camera protocols, adding equipment the old woman suggested, silver wire around memory cards, cameras pointed at crossroads rather than straight trails, backup batteries blessed by medicine people who understood that technology and tradition weren't opposing forces, but complementary approaches to understanding. And 3 months after Connor Burke disappeared, Lisa was hiking the Needles district when she encountered him. The thing wearing his shape, still playing the role, still acting as though search and rescue would find him eventually. It smiled at her with Connor's smile, spoke with Connor's voice, asked about the investigation with Connor's casual interest. But Lisa had learned. She'd learned to see the small wrongnesses, the way its shadow fell at angles that didn't match sun position, the fact that its boots left no tracks despite walking through sand, the slight delay between its lips moving and words emerging, as if whatever intelligence controlled the meat puppet had to consciously remember how speech synchronization worked. "Hello, Connor," Lisa said carefully, her hand resting on the herb bundle in her pocket. "We've been looking for you." "I know," it replied, and for just a moment the mask slipped. The voice layered wrong, the face too still, the eyes reflecting light at an angle that suggested they weren't entirely solid. "We appreciate your concern, but some of us prefer the desert to civilization. Some of us like the space between places better than the places themselves." Lisa maintained eye contact, remembered the advice. Show fear and they feed on it, show aggression and they'll retaliate. Show neither and they get confused, uncertain how to categorize you as prey or threat. "I understand. I also prefer spaces between. That's why I became a field biologist rather than laboratory researcher." The thing wearing Connor tilted its head, studying her with interest that felt clinical rather than predatory. "You've changed, Ranger Hoffman. You used to measure everything, trust only data, dismiss what you couldn't quantify. Now you carry herbs in your pocket and avoid speaking our name directly. The old woman taught you well. She taught me that reality is larger than my education prepared me for. That ancestral knowledge accumulated across millennia might have validity my 4 years of graduate school didn't provide. That's good science, updating your model when new evidence contradicts old assumptions. And yet you still work for them. Still wear the uniform, still carry the radio, still pretend that institutional power can manage what lives in these canyons." The thing's smile widened, and Lisa saw too many teeth, arranged in patterns that suggested its jaw was flexible in ways human jaws weren't. "You're caught between worlds now, biologist. Not quite believer, not quite skeptic, not quite prey, not quite threat. Useful, maybe, or dangerous. We haven't decided." Lisa forced herself to breathe steadily, to maintain the careful neutrality that kept her alive. "I'm documenting, building evidence, protecting people who don't know what they're walking into when they hike these trails. That's my job, whether you understand it or not. We understand jobs, we understand roles and purposes and functions. We're very good at wearing them, at performing humanity convincingly enough that even experts can't tell the difference." The thing stepped closer and Lisa smelled that impossible scent. Desert sun and something older, something that predated humans by enough millennia that comparison became meaningless. But understanding and caring are different things. We don't care about your job, Ranger Hoffman. We care about hunger, and you smell like someone who's learned just enough to be interesting, but not enough to be truly dangerous. Then it was gone. Not walking away, but simply absent, leaving Lisa standing alone on the trail with her heart hammering and the herb bundle burning hot against her palm like it had absorbed heat from warding off something her eyes couldn't properly see. She filed no report about the encounter, added it instead to the private documentation she maintained, the shadow case file that tracked patterns and incidents that official records couldn't acknowledge. And she continued her work, her patrols, her camera monitoring, operating now with dual consciousness. The official role that counted sheep and tracked weather patterns and performed wilderness management, and the shadow role that watched for signs of things that wore human faces without being human, that hunted in spaces her education insisted couldn't exist. Connor Burke's body was never recovered officially. His case remained open, his family held memorial services, and something wearing his shape was seen occasionally in Moab, living a life that resembled his own well enough that most people never questioned whether the man they knew was exactly who they thought he was. But Lisa questioned. Had learned to question everything, to look for the wrongnesses that indicated reality wasn't quite cohering properly, to recognize that her earlier certainty had been armor against understanding rather than tool for it. The desert had broken her arrogance the way it broke most things that entered believing they understood it, through simple persistence, through revealing layer after layer of strangeness until resistance became exhausting and acceptance became the path of least resistance. She never found that impossible chamber again, though she searched. Never encountered the old Navajo woman who taught her that folklore was functional rather than metaphorical. But she carried that knowledge forward, modified her work to include protection she'd once have mocked as superstition, warned hikers about things the NPS manual didn't acknowledge existed, and sometimes reviewing trail camera footage late at night in her office, Lisa would find them, frames that showed figures standing motionless, watching with patient hunger, waiting for the next solo hiker who walked into their territory without proper respect or recognition. She'd document them carefully, add them to her shadow files, and continue the work of trying to protect people from threats that institutional power refused to acknowledge. The skeptic in her, the part that had earned biology degrees and published papers about population dynamics, never fully surrendered. Still demanded evidence, still sought patterns, still tried to build frameworks that could explain what she'd experienced. But that skeptic now operated alongside something else, something that recognized there were ways of knowing that didn't require peer review. That ancestral wisdom sometimes encoded truths that took science centuries to rediscover. That being wrong about the fundamental nature of reality didn't mean abandoning the scientific method, but expanding it to include data sets her education had trained her to dismiss. Lisa Hoffman remained a ranger, remained a biologist, remained someone who measured and documented and tried to make sense of wilderness through careful observation. But she'd learned that careful observation sometimes revealed things that contradicted everything you thought you knew, and that the appropriate response wasn't to reject the observation, but to question the framework that couldn't accommodate it. The desert kept its secrets. The Yi Nald Lushi kept hunting, and Lisa kept watching, documenting, protecting what she could while acknowledging that protection had limits when the threats existed in spaces between spaces, or faces stolen from victims, and operated according to rules that predated human civilization by enough time that comparison became meaningless. That was the real horror. Not that monsters existed, but that they were patient, that they hunted in plain sight wearing familiar faces, that they'd adapted to human presence by becoming perfect mimics, indistinguishable from what they copied. Science could document them, tribal knowledge could recognize them, but neither could eliminate them, because they existed in the gaps between belief systems, thriving precisely where certainty failed and consensus fractured. Connor Burke's family mourned. The thing wearing his shape continued playing its role. And somewhere in Canyonlands, in a chamber that existed in desert but not quite of it, 7 bodies maintained breathing and heartbeat without consciousness, their stolen selves walking around in skin they'd been born in but no longer owned. Lisa documented everything, built evidence that would be dismissed, warned people who wouldn't listen, and continued the work of trying to protect those who entered wilderness without understanding that some places were genuinely wild in ways that civilization couldn't domesticate, that some hungers couldn't be satisfied by anything humans considered food, that some things wore faces for the same reason hunters wore camouflage, to get close enough to prey before the prey realized it was being hunted. The trail cameras kept recording. The figures kept appearing. And Lisa Hoffman kept watching, the reformed skeptic who'd learned that reality was larger and stranger than her education had suggested, that some questions didn't have answers that fit existing frameworks, that the appropriate response to encountering the impossible wasn't to deny it, but to expand your understanding until the impossible became simply improbable, documented and managed as best as limited human power allowed. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Emily Sorensen found the journal at mile marker 12, its pages swollen with moisture that wasn't rain. The Hoh River Trail stretched ahead through cathedral columns of Sitka spruce, their trunks thick as cars and wrapped in velvet moss that glowed emerald even in the weak October light. She'd been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 3 seasons, long enough to know that the forest kept secrets in its bones, and short enough that the knowing still made her skin crawl in ways she couldn't explain to her supervisor. The journal lay open on a nurse log, its spine cracked at an angle that suggested violence rather than carelessness. Emily crouched beside it, her Garmin GPS unit beeping softly on her belt. 12.3 miles from the visitor center, exactly where Sophia Carr's day pack had been reported by hikers 2 mornings ago. Everything else belonging to the missing woman remained absent. Tent, sleeping bag, the expensive Canon camera Sophia's sister had mentioned during the initial report. Just this journal, and the wrongness that radiated from it like heat from coals. Emily didn't touch it immediately. She'd learned young that some objects carried weight beyond their physical mass. Her grandmother's word for it had been tsukareda, tired, worn down by accumulated emotion. Her mother had dismissed it as superstitious nonsense from the old country, but Emily had felt it her whole life. The psychic residue of human suffering clinging to places and things like oil film on water. The journal in front of her practically vibrated with it. She photographed it first, documenting its position with 3 different angles before sliding on nitrile gloves and lifting the cover. The handwriting inside was controlled, almost compulsively neat, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone fighting hard to maintain composure. Sophia Carr had been 28, a freelance photographer from Portland specializing in Pacific Northwest wilderness. Her permit indicated a solo 4-day backpacking trip along the Hoh River Trail, summiting at Blue Glacier before looping back. She'd checked in at the ranger station 72 hours ago, told Emily's colleague David Ramirez that she was chasing the perfect shot of old growth in fog. The first entry was dated 3 days prior, written in that precise hand. Mile 5. The trees here remember things. I know how that sounds, but I can feel it. Not hostile, just aware, like walking through a sleeping giant's dream. The moss absorbs all sound. It's beautiful. It's suffocating. Emily's radio crackled. She flinched at the sound, annoyed at her own jumpiness. Sorensen, this is base. Status update? She pressed the transmit button on her Motorola. 12 miles in on Hoh River Trail. Found the missing hiker's journal. No sign of Carr herself yet. Continuing search pattern northeast toward Lewis Meadow. Copy that. Weather's deteriorating. Front moving in faster than predicted. You've got maybe 4 hours of decent visibility. Understood. Sorensen out. She turned back to the journal, flipping through pages that grew progressively more disturbed. Sophia's entries became shorter, more fragmented. Mile 8. Can't shake the feeling of being watched, not by animals. Something else. The cold here doesn't make sense. It's coming from inside the trees. Then, Mile 10. Found something strange off trail. Old structure, maybe 1920s logging camp. Decay rung. Everything rotted except one building. Wood shouldn't preserve like that in this climate. Took photos. Won't develop them. Don't want to see what might be in the windows. Emily's breath misted in the air, which shouldn't be possible. It was October in western Washington, mild for the season, temperature holding in the mid-50s according to her gear. She exhaled again, watching vapor curl from her lips like smoke. The sensation of being observed, which she'd been suppressing since entering this section of trail, suddenly intensified into something physical. Pressure against her temples, a ringing in her ears like after a concert. The next journal entry was written in a different pen, the ink darker, the letters jagged. They cut her hair first. That's what the ranger told me, the old one. The Japanese woman who isn't in any of the park records I looked up online. She said they shaved Kimiko Tanaka's head before burning the house. Said it was mercy that hair could trap the spirit. But they did it to humiliate her, didn't they? To strip away the last dignity before the fire. Emily's hands had gone numb. She wasn't cold exactly. The sensation was more like submersion, like dropping through water into a darkness that had been waiting specifically for her. Kimiko Tanaka. The name resonated in her chest cavity like a struck bell. She didn't know it. had never heard it before, but her body recognized it anyway, some ancestral acknowledgement that made her want to run. She forced herself to keep reading. The ranger, her name tag said Sorensen, but she looked wrong, like a photograph superimposed over reality. She told me Kimiko worked as a camp cook in 1942. Unmarried, 31 years old, the only Japanese person for 50 miles after the internment orders. They didn't intern her because the logging camp was so remote, so needed. She cooked their meals and cleaned their quarters and never complained. Then someone's wedding ring went missing. Then money from a footlocker. They blamed Kimiko because who else could it be? Strung her up from the big hemlock, the one that's still there, the one with the broken branch. But she didn't die from the rope. Took too long. They got impatient. Set the bunkhouse on fire with her inside. The journal ended there, mid-page, the rest of the book virgin paper. Emily stood abruptly, her equilibrium swinging like she'd surfaced too fast from deep water. The forest had changed while she read, or her perception of it had. The moss seemed darker, less emerald and more the color of deep bruises. The spaces between trees had multiplied, geometry that made her eyes water when she tried to focus, and the temperature continued dropping, her breath now coming in thick clouds despite the mild October air that should be holding steady. She needed to radio this in, get SAR mobilized with the journal as evidence of Sophia's mental state. But when Emily reached for her Motorola, her fingers closed on empty air. The radio was gone from her belt, though she could have sworn she'd clipped it there after the last transmission. Her GPS unit was also missing. The bear spray canister from her chest holster, gone. She patted her pockets frantically, finding only her compass, which spun uselessly without settling on any direction. "Okay," she said aloud, needing to hear her own voice to anchor reality. "Equipment failure, not impossible. Stay calm and retrace steps to last known position." But when she turned around, the trail had vanished. Not obscured by fog or hidden by fallen timber, simply absent, as if it had never existed. She stood in a clearing of ferns and moss that stretched in all directions, the massive trees forming walls without gaps, their roots weaving patterns that looked increasingly deliberate the longer she stared. And in the distance, barely visible through the timber, a structure emerged from the gloom. Wooden walls weathered silver, a collapsed roof, windows that gaped like empty eye sockets. The building from Sophia's journal, the one that shouldn't be preserved, the one where they burned Kimiko Tanaka alive 75 years ago. Emily's gift, curse, liability, whatever name best fit, had always been subtle before. A sick feeling in old houses, headaches at accident sites, dreams that warned her away from certain hiking trails. But this was different. This was reality bending itself around trauma so profound that it had carved permanent scars in the fabric of whatever separated the physical world from what lay beneath. And she, with her sensitivity, her cursed receptiveness to the suffering of the dead, had been marked the moment she touched that journal. She started walking toward the structure because what else could she do? The trees permitted no other direction. The moss under her boots made no sound, as if even the forest floor was holding its breath. As she approached, details resolved. A doorway listing on broken hinges, kanji characters carved into the lintel that her grandmother had tried to teach her but she'd never bothered to learn properly. Something about hair and binding. Something about return. Inside the structure, what remained of furniture had fused with the floorboards. Beds and tables melted into the wood like they'd been exposed to intense heat, though the building itself showed no char marks. In the far corner, barely visible in the failing light, a shape huddled that might have been a pile of old fabric or might have been something else. "Sophia?" Emily's voice cracked. "Sophia Carr?" The shape didn't respond, but something else did. The temperature dropped so fast that ice crystals formed on Emily's eyelashes. Her lungs seized, air too cold to process, and when she gasped, she tasted copper and ash. Then came the sound. Not quite footsteps, more like weight distributing across old floorboards, and with it the smell, decay and incense, funeral flowers left too long in stagnant water. Emily spun toward the doorway and froze. A woman stood in the entrance, silhouetted against the failing daylight. She wore white, not the white of clean linen but the white of bone left to weather, of snow that's absorbed pollution. Her hair hung in front of her face in a black curtain so thick that no features were visible, the strands reaching past her waist and moving independently of any breeze. When she raised one arm, the sleeve fell back to reveal skin that had the waxy, translucent quality of something long submerged. Emily's gift screamed at her, every nerve firing warnings that came 75 years too late. This was Kimiko Tanaka, or what remained after decades of rage had burned away everything human, leaving only the Onryo, the vengeance spirit from her grandmother's stories, the thing that returned when injustice went unpunished, when shame and fury outlived the body that first contained them. The figure took a step forward, and Emily saw what lay beneath the black hair. Not a face, but an absence of face. Features smoothed away by fire until only eye sockets remained, deep and dark and fixed on Emily with unmistakable recognition. "I didn't..." Emily's voice failed. She tried again. "I didn't hurt you, that wasn't me." But that didn't matter, did it? Her grandmother had explained the rules of Onryo when Emily was young enough to have nightmares about them. They didn't discriminate. Vengeance without discretion. Punishment for proximity. And Emily, with her sensitivity, her openness to the spiritual world, was more than merely proximate. She was permeable. The spirit lunged. Emily threw herself sideways, crashed through rotten furniture, felt splinters drive into her palms. The Onryo moved in a way that violated physics, one moment in the doorway, the next directly behind Emily, that smell of decay intensifying until Emily's stomach heaved. She rolled, came up running, burst through the structure's back wall where the wood gave way like paper. Outside, the forest had changed again, or perhaps revealed its true nature. The trees stood closer together now, their branches interweaving overhead to block all but the weakest light. And everywhere, carved into bark, painted on stones, scratched into the moss, were symbols Emily recognized from her childhood. Kanji for binding, return, hair, shame. Some looked old, weathered by decades. Others were fresh, cut recently into living wood. Sophia had been here, had seen these, had written about them in her journal before whatever happened to her happened. Emily ran deeper into the trees, her ranger training screaming that she should stay put, that moving in reduced visibility was how people died in the wilderness. But staying meant facing the Onryo again, meant feeling that supernatural cold that seemed to freeze not just flesh, but the electrical impulses in her brain, the chemical reactions that sustained thought and identity. She burst into a clearing and stopped so abruptly she nearly fell. 27 photographs hung from branches like obscene fruit, each one fixed with wire through punched holes in the cardstock. Sophia's photographs, Emily recognized the professional quality, the careful composition. But the subject matter was wrong. Each image showed the same scene, the structure where Emily had found the journal, but occupied. In the windows, pale faces pressed against the glass. In the doorway, that white-clad figure, hair obscuring everything above the shoulders. And in every photograph, getting progressively closer to the camera, approaching through frames like a flipbook animation of pursuit. The final photograph showed only darkness and that hair, filling the entire frame, individual strands visible in terrible detail. Emily's radio, the one that had disappeared from her belt, lay at the base of the tree where the last photograph hung. When she picked it up, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it, the device crackled with a voice that wasn't quite the dispatcher's, wasn't quite human. "They cut her hair first," the radio said, words grinding like stones, "stripped her dignity, burned her alive for crimes she didn't commit. 75 years of rage, Ranger. 75 years of hunting. Do you understand? The forest remembers. The trees remember. And I remember." "Where is Sophia Carr?" Emily demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "What did you do to her?" "The photographer?" Laughter like wind through hollow logs. "She came looking for beauty and found truth instead. She photographed what should stay hidden. She saw me in the windows, in the reflections, in the negative space between trees. She tried to run, they all try to run." Emily thought of Sophia's journal, those final entries written in different ink, describing things she couldn't have known. She's dead, isn't she? Dead. Alive. These words have lost meaning here. The photographer is where she belongs now, keeping me company in the place where they trapped me, where they thought rope and fire could end what they started with cruelty. But shame doesn't die, Ranger. Injustice doesn't decompose, and neither do I. The radio died with a burst of static. Emily stood in the clearing, surrounded by photographs of her own approaching death, and made a decision that probably meant her own end, but was the only choice her training and her conscience would allow. She needed to find Sophia Carr's body. She needed to document this, and if she couldn't leave this forest alive, she could at least leave evidence. She pulled out the journal from her pack, clicked on her headlamp, thankfully still functioning, and began to write, documenting everything. The location, the symbols, the photographs, the encounter with the Onryo. Her hand cramped from writing so fast, words sometimes illegible in her haste, but she captured the essential facts. If another ranger found this, if someone came looking, they needed to understand what waited in these woods. As she wrote, the temperature continued dropping. Frost formed on the photographs above her head, crystals spreading across Sophia's captured images until the faces in the windows were obscured by ice. Emily's breath came in shorter gasps, each inhalation burning her throat. When she finished writing, she carefully placed the journal at the base of the tree, weighted it down with rocks so it wouldn't blow away. Then she turned to face the forest and spoke clearly, hoping the Onryo could hear, hoping some trace of Kimiko Tanaka still existed beneath the rage. "You were wronged," Emily said. "Murdered for crimes you didn't commit, left to burn while innocent. I acknowledge that. I witness it, and I'm sorry. Not for myself, because apologies from strangers mean nothing. I'm sorry that justice never came. I'm sorry that shame outlived those who should have carried it. I'm sorry that your name was forgotten while your killers probably died peacefully in their beds." Silence. Then, from behind her, "Sorry doesn't restore stolen dignity." Emily turned slowly. The Onryo stood 5 feet away, close enough that Emily could see the details her mind had tried to erase during the first encounter. The melted flesh, the exposed bone structure, the way the hair moved with purposeful intelligence like it was somehow alive, somehow the most vital part of what remained. "No," Emily agreed. "Sorry doesn't fix anything, but maybe witness does. Maybe acknowledgement does. You've been alone here for 75 years, with only victims to punish and no one to confirm that what happened to you was monstrous. I see you, Kimiko Tanaka. I know what they did. And I'm telling your story. It's written in that journal, and other rangers will find it, and your name will be remembered for something other than their shame." The spirit tilted her head, an eerily human gesture that made Emily's chest constrict. "You think words in a book matter to the dead?" "I think rage this strong comes from wanting to be seen," Emily said, her grandmother's lessons surfacing through decades of dismissal. "I think you've been screaming into silence for 3/4 of a century, and I think maybe, if someone finally listens, if someone finally acknowledges the injustice without flinching from it, maybe the screaming can stop." "The photographer didn't listen," the Onryo said. "She only saw material for her art. She photographed suffering like it was aesthetic." Emily's stomach turned. "Where is she?" The spirit gestured toward the structure. That slow movement that suggested time operated differently for her. "In the place where they trapped me, where her camera captured my image one too many times, trapping me again in silver and chemicals. So I showed her what it means to be trapped, to be bound by others' perception, to have your humanity reduced to a cautionary tale." Emily started toward the structure, her legs heavy as if moving through waist-deep water. The Onryo followed, not threatening exactly, but present. A cold pressure at Emily's back that made her skin crawl. Inside the building, Emily's headlamp illuminated what she'd been too panicked to examine properly before. Sophia Carr sat in the far corner, back against the wall, camera still clutched in her hands. Her eyes were open but unseeing, her face locked in an expression of terminal terror. But she was breathing, Shallow, irregular breaths that suggested something between life and death, consciousness trapped in a body that couldn't escape. Jesus Christ, Emily whispered. She knelt beside Sophia, checked her pulse. Thready, but present. Sophia, can you hear me? No response. Sophia's eyes didn't track Emily's movements, didn't respond to the light shining directly into them. Whatever the Onryo had done, it had left Sophia functionally catatonic, trapped in her own mind the way Kimiko had been trapped in this structure. Let her go, Emily said, standing to face the spirit. This isn't justice. This is just more cruelty, more injustice. You're becoming what they were. Someone who punishes the innocent because punishment feels better than powerlessness. The innocent? The Onryo's voice rose, the windows rattling in their frames. She exploited tragedy for profit, turned suffering into portfolio pieces. How is that innocent? She's a photographer, Emily said desperately. She takes pictures. That's not the same as what they did to you. That's not even close. And if you can't see the difference, then they won. They burned away your humanity so thoroughly that all that's left is rage without reason, the spirit screamed. And it was worse than any sound Emily had heard in her life, not because of volume, but because of what it contained. Decades of pain compressed into a single expression, all the words Kimiko Tanaka never got to say when they put the rope around her neck, when they shaved her head, when they watched her burn. The structure shook, boards splintering, the roof dropping chunks of rotten wood. But Emily stood her ground, even as her ears rang and blood trickled from her nose. I'm not leaving without her, she said when the sound finally stopped. If you want to trap someone, trap me instead. I'm the one with the gift, the sensitivity. I'm the one who can actually hear you, really hear you, not just photograph what I don't understand. I'll stay. I'll witness your story for as long as it takes. But let Sophia Carr go. The Onryo moved closer, that hair reaching out to brush against Emily's face. Where it touched, Emily's skin went numb, cells dying on contact with something that had been dead for so long that its corruption had become contagious. The spirit leaned in, those empty eye sockets inches from Emily's face, and whispered in a voice that might have once been beautiful before fire destroyed her throat. You would trade yourself for someone you don't even know? That's what Rangers do, Emily said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. We protect people in these spaces, even from things we don't fully understand, even from injustices that predate our birth. Let her go, Kimiko. Let one person leave this forest with their mind intact. Show me that compassion didn't burn away completely. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the Onryo withdrew, that black hair retreating like living shadow. The temperature rose fractionally, still cold, but no longer the bone-deep freeze that suggested proximity to something that had learned to weaponize absence of warmth. Take her, the spirit said. But you'll leave something behind. That's the price of witness. Part of you stays here, part of you carries this story, and you'll never be quite warm again, Ranger. Never quite free of knowing what humans can do to each other when they're afraid, when they need someone to blame. That's the real curse, not the supernatural horror, but the banal evil that creates it. Emily nodded, understanding the terms even if she didn't fully comprehend the mechanism. She grabbed Sophia under the arms, started dragging her toward the door. The photographer was dead weight, still catatonic, but Emily pulled with everything she had, her ranger training kicking in with proper lifting techniques, distribution of weight. At the doorway, Emily paused, looking back at the Onryo one final time. Your name is Kimiko Tanaka, she said clearly. You were 31 years old. You worked as a camp cook. You were murdered in 1942 by men who needed someone to blame for their own failures. That's the truth. That's what I'll tell anyone who will listen. You weren't a cautionary tale or a ghost story or a warning. You were a person, and what happened to you was inexcusable. The spirit said nothing, but something in the quality of her silence felt less like rage and more like grief. The original emotion that fury had been protecting all these decades. Then she faded, not disappearing exactly but receding. her presence withdrawing to somewhere deeper in the structure, deeper in the woods, deeper in whatever dimension the truly wronged dead inhabited. Emily dragged Sophia into the forest. The trees moved aside this time, branches parting to reveal the trail, the actual trail, marked with the familiar blazes that Emily knew by heart. Her radio crackled back to life on her belt, the dispatcher's voice cutting through static with coordinates and weather updates that made sense again, time resuming its normal flow. It took her 3 hours to get Sophia to the nearest trail access point, where a SAR team was already mobilized searching for them both. The paramedics took over, loaded Sophia onto a stretcher, started asking Emily questions she couldn't fully answer because some truths don't translate into official reports. In the ambulance, under harsh fluorescent light that made everything feel brutally real, Sophia suddenly grabbed Emily's wrist. Her eyes focused for the first time in hours, terror giving way to confusion. "Did you see her?" Sophia whispered. "The woman with the hair?" "Yes," Emily said simply. "I couldn't stop photographing her. She was in every shot, closer each time, and I couldn't stop. It was like my camera was possessed, like she was pulling herself through the lens into the real world, using my work as a bridge." "She's trapped there," Emily said, "in that place where they killed her, and she's angry, but also alone. 75 years alone with no one acknowledging what happened to her." Sophia's grip tightened. "You talked to her." "I witnessed her," Emily corrected. "I listened, and I promised to tell her story." Over the following weeks, as Sophia recovered in Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, Emily researched Olympic National Park archives, historical societies, interviews with elderly locals who remembered the old logging camps. She found Kimiko Tanaka in faded records, a single photograph from 1941, a young woman with long black hair smiling at the camera, proud and dignified. Employment records showing she worked at Camp 7 from 1939 to 1942. A death certificate listing accidental fire as cause, signed by a coroner who was also the camp supervisor, witnessed by men who later bought property with mysterious cash infusions. Emily wrote it all down, compiled it into a report that went far beyond standard NPS documentation. She sent copies to historical societies, to Japanese-American community organizations, to anyone who might ensure Kimiko Tanaka's name lived somewhere other than in rage and frost and the spaces between trees. She returned to the Hoh River Trail once more, 3 months later, when winter had properly settled over Olympic National Park. Snow covered the forest in silence, and Emily walked the familiar path with offerings she'd researched carefully. White chrysanthemums, incense sake in a ceramic bottle. At mile marker 12, she found the structure, now just a collapsed pile of rotting timber, no longer preserved beyond reason. Emily arranged the offerings carefully, bowed in the manner her grandmother had taught her decades ago, and spoke Kimiko's name 3 times to the quiet forest. She didn't see the onryo again, but she felt something release, a tension in the air dissipating like held breath finally exhaled. The cold that had settled into Emily's bones after that first encounter never fully left. Even in summer, she carried an extra layer, needed the heat turned higher than her colleagues, woke sometimes in the night with frost forming on her windows from the inside. It was the price of witness, as the onryo had promised. A permanent reminder that some horrors don't end. They just find people willing to acknowledge them. Sophia Carr left the Pacific Northwest 3 weeks after her discharge from the hospital. Before she left, she gave Emily a small box containing every photograph from that trip, undeveloped rolls of film that she'd never printed and never would. "I can't look at them," Sophia said, "but I can't destroy them either. Maybe someday someone will need to see what I saw. Maybe they'll understand better than I did." Emily kept the box in her ranger station office filed under evidence ongoing, because that's what it was. Evidence that the land remembered, that injustice carved scars visible only to those willing to look, that the dead sometimes refused to rest until someone finally acknowledged their names and their stories without flinching from the horrible truth. On quiet nights when Emily patrolled the Hoh River Trail, she sometimes saw movement in her peripheral vision, black hair in the distance, white fabric between trees. but she never felt threatened. The Onryo's rage had diminished from forest fire to candle flame, sustained now not by vengeance but by the simple fact of being remembered. Kimiko Tanaka existed in record now, her humanity preserved in documents and interviews, and Emily's steadfast refusal to let her story be reduced to ghost story cliché. The forest kept its secrets, but some secrets needed telling. Some wounds needed witness before they could begin to heal, and Emily, with her cursed gift of sensitivity, her unwanted receptiveness to the suffering of the dead, had finally found the purpose it implied, not to flee from the horror humanity created, but to stand in it long enough to say the names of those it destroyed. On her final patrol before winter closure of the trail, Emily placed one last offering at mile marker 12, a photograph she'd found in the archives, the one of Kimiko smiling in 1941, her long black hair catching sunlight, proud and alive and deserving of better than she received. She weighted it down with stones so it wouldn't blow away, a marker for a grave that never officially existed, a memorial for someone who'd been erased from records, but never from the land that absorbed her anguish. The temperature dropped as Emily stood there, her breath misting in the late autumn air. But this time the cold felt different, less like assault and more like acknowledgement, less like curse and more like covenant. She'd promised to remember, and she would. For the rest of her life she'd carry this story, this cold, this knowledge of what humans could do to each other when fear turned neighbor against neighbor. That was the real horror Kimiko Tanaka had tried to teach her. Not the supernatural manifestation, but the all-too-human cruelty that created it. The rope and the fire and the shaved head were Gothic window dressing on a simple, terrible truth. That injustice doesn't die with its victims, and shame outlives those who should have carried it. Emily touched her fingers to the photograph, bowed once more and walked back down the trail toward civilization. The forest watched her go, the trees standing sentinel over secrets they'd held for 7 decades and would hold for 7 more. And somewhere in the spaces between those trees, a woman with long black hair and a white dress stood beside her own image, finally witnessed, finally named, finally remembered for who she'd been before humans made her into something else. The cold followed Emily down the mountain, settling deeper into her bones with every step. But she didn't mind anymore. It was honest, this cold. A fair price for truth, for justice delayed but not fully denied, for the hard work of looking at horror without flinching and saying, yes, this happened, and someone needs to remember so it doesn't happen again. That was enough. That had to be enough, because some stories didn't have happy endings, only true ones. And truth was its own kind of memorial for those who died in rage and shame, and the terrible silence of being forgotten. Emily Sorensen walked out of the forest carrying Kimiko Tanaka's story like a weight she'd never fully set down, and in the years that followed, whenever someone asked about the cold that never left her, she'd tell them about the woman who was murdered in 1942, whose name was erased from history but not from the land, who taught a young ranger that the most haunting ghosts are the ones we create through our own cruelty. That was the story. That was the witness. That was the price and the purpose both. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The photographs were wrong. Not blurry, not corrupted. Wrong. Benjamin Reeves had taken them himself 3 days ago. Empty trail, afternoon light through Douglas firs, routine documentation. But the face in frame 14 hadn't been there. Couldn't have been there. A woman's face, pale as paper, partially obscured by black hair, staring directly at the camera from between 2 trees he'd walked past without seeing anything. He'd noticed it an hour ago while cataloging the week's patrol images on his laptop. At first he'd thought it was a trick of shadow and moss, the kind of pareidolia that made people see faces in wood grain or clouds. But when he zoomed in, the resolution was too good, the details too specific. The woman's eyes were open. She was looking at him. Benjamin's hands had gone cold. Not a chill, but a sudden absence of warmth, as if the heat had been pulled from his skin. He knew that feeling, Had felt it before in certain sections of the Hoh rainforest where the moss grew thick enough to muffle sound completely. In the abandoned homestead near Deer Park where the air tasted like rust. In the grove of Sitka spruces near Rialto Beach where birds refused to nest despite ideal conditions. He'd learned to ignore that feeling during his 8 years as a ranger at Olympic National Park. Learned to rationalize it as nothing more than his mind playing tricks. The result of too much solitude and too many nights reading about local disappearances before bed. But the face in the photograph wouldn't rationalize. It was there, captured at 2:47 p.m. on October 4, 2011 on the Spruce Railroad Trail, exactly where Kayla Morrison had been reported missing 2 days later. Benjamin closed the laptop and walked to the window of the ranger station. Outside, the October rain fell in sheets across Lake Crescent, turning the water the color of slate. The Douglas firs surrounding the station swayed in the wind, their branches scraping against the roof with sounds like fingernails on wood. It was 11:47 p.m. He was alone. He'd been alone since his shift partner, Dave Chen, had transferred to North Cascades 3 months ago, leaving Benjamin as the sole overnight presence at the Fairholme station. The face in the photograph had Kayla Morrison's bone structure. He was sure of it now. He'd studied her missing person photo for days. The 26-year-old graduate student from Seattle who'd been researching old-growth forest ecology, last seen on the Spruce Railroad Trail on October 6th. Her car had been found in the parking area, tent still set up at her permitted campsite, field notes organized neatly in waterproof bags. No signs of struggle, no signs of anything except an abrupt absence as if she'd simply stepped off the edge of the world. But she'd been there on October 4th. In Benjamin's photograph, 2 days before she was reported missing, which meant either his camera's timestamp was wrong or something impossible had happened. Benjamin opened the laptop again. The face stared back at him, partially obscured but unmistakable now that he knew what he was looking for. The way the hair fell across her features, the angle of her jaw, but the expression was wrong. Kayla's missing person photo showed a woman with bright eyes and an easy smile. The face in frame 14 had no expression at all, just a blank, terrible stillness. He scrolled to frame 15. Empty trail, identical angle, 1 second later. Frame 16. Empty. 17. 18. All empty. Just the one image with the face, as if she'd existed for exactly 1 second before vanishing again. The cold feeling spread from Benjamin's hands up his arms. Not fear exactly. He'd learned to distinguish between rational concern and the other thing, the sense that had plagued him since childhood. His grandmother had called it sensitivity, the Portuguese word sliding off her tongue with a mixture of pride and warning. She'd had it too, she said, the ability to feel when places were wrong, when the boundary between what should be and what shouldn't be had worn thin. She'd told him to trust it, to listen when his body warned him. But his parents had been scientists, rational people who dismissed his childhood nightmares as overactive imagination. By the time he was 12, he'd learned to suppress it, to build walls between his conscious mind and whatever part of him registered wrongness like others registered temperature. Those walls were crumbling now. Benjamin grabbed his Motorola XTR radio and considered calling it in, but calling what in? A face in a photograph that might be pareidolia, might be a timestamp error, might be nothing at all. Search and rescue had already combed the Spruce Railroad Trail twice. They'd found nothing. The official theory was that Kayla had gone off trail, possibly fallen, possibly gotten disoriented in the dense undergrowth. The Hoh rainforest could swallow people whole if they weren't careful. Every year, someone underestimated the terrain, overestimated their navigation skills, and vanished into the green cathedral of moss and ferns and ancient trees. But Benjamin had walked that section of trail. He'd felt it. The wrongness had been so thick he'd nearly turned back, had forced himself to continue only because turning back would have meant acknowledging what he was feeling, and he'd spent too many years building those walls to let them collapse over a feeling. He saved the photograph to a flash drive and shut down the laptop. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the station's roof with increasing urgency. The wind howled through the Douglas firs, and Benjamin thought he heard something else beneath it. A sound like breathing, rhythmic and wet. He stood absolutely still, listening. The sound faded. Probably just water running through the downspouts. Probably nothing. His Garmin GPS Map 64 sat on the desk next to his rain gear. He picked it up, checked the battery level, and clipped it to his belt. He told himself he was just being prepared, that checking his gear was routine. But he knew he was lying. He was preparing to go out there, to the Spruce Railroad Trail, to the exact spot where he'd taken frame 14. The rational part of his mind, the part his parents had nurtured and his training had reinforced, told him this was stupid. It was nearly midnight. The rain was getting worse. He was alone. And if something happened, there'd be no one to call for backup until the day shift arrived at 6 a.m. But the other part of him, the part he'd spent years trying to suppress, was screaming. That part knew something was wrong with a certainty that transcended logic, and it wouldn't let him rest until he'd gone back to that trail. Benjamin put on his rain gear, a Gore-Tex jacket and waterproof pants, both dark green with the National Park Service logo, and grabbed his Streamlight ProTac flashlight. He checked his emergency kit, first aid supplies, emergency beacon, space blanket, waterproof matches, compass. His Benchmade bushcrafter knife hung from his belt in its leather sheath. Everything regulation, everything by the book, as if following procedure could protect him from whatever he was about to walk into. He left a note on the desk: Spruce Railroad Trail, 11:58 p.m., investigating Morrison disappearance, and locked the station behind him. His Ford F-250 sat in the parking area, water streaming off its hood. The drive to the Spruce Railroad trailhead would take 20 minutes in good weather. In this rain, probably 30. Benjamin started the engine and pulled onto Route 101, heading west. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. The road was empty, the forest pressing in from both sides, a solid wall of darkness broken only by his headlights. He passed the turnoff to Storm King Ranger Station, past the boat launch at Fairholme, past the handful of cabins where tourists stayed in summer but which now sat dark and abandoned with the approach of winter. The Spruce Railroad Trail parking area appeared on his right, a small pullout barely visible in the rain. He parked next to Kayla Morrison's car, a silver Honda Civic that had been sitting here for over a week now, waiting for an owner who would never return. The sight of it sent fresh cold through Benjamin's chest. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the rain. The sound of water hitting his hood was deafening. Rain poured through the canopy above, channeled by thousands of branches and leaves into concentrated streams. Benjamin switched on the flashlight and started down the trail. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow path that ran along Lake Crescent's northern shore. To his left, the lake was invisible beyond the trees, though he could hear waves lapping against the rocky beach. To his right, the forest rose steeply, old-growth Douglas firs and western hemlocks creating a ceiling so dense that even in daylight, the trail existed in permanent twilight. He walked quickly, counting his steps. The spot where he'd taken frame 14 was approximately half a mile in, just before the first tunnel. The trail here had been part of an old railroad line that once hauled timber and supplies around the lake. Now the rails were gone. The grade converted to a hiking path, but the tunnels remained. 3 of them carved through solid rock, dark throats that swallowed hikers for brief stretches before spitting them back out into the filtered green light of the rainforest. Benjamin's sensitivity kicked in before he reached the spot. It hit him like walking into a wall of ice water, that sudden, breath-stealing cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The air itself felt wrong, too thick, pressing against him from all sides. His flashlight beam seemed weaker somehow, as if the darkness here was denser, hungrier. He stopped walking. This was it, the exact spot. He recognized the 2 Douglas firs on the right side of the trail, their trunks marked with the bright green moss he'd photographed. But something was different now. Between the trees, just visible in his flashlight's beam, was a shape. A dark mass that hadn't been there 3 days ago. Benjamin approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The shape resolved as he got closer. A tent. Not Kayla's tent. Hers was still at her campsite, miles away. This was different. Older. The fabric was stained dark with moisture and something else. Something that might have been mold or might have been blood. It was partially collapsed, the support poles bent at unnatural angles. He called out, "National Park Service. Is anyone in there?" No response. Just the rain and the wet breathing sound of water moving through the forest. Benjamin circled the tent, looking for an entrance. The zipper was open, the flap hanging loose. He aimed his flashlight inside. Empty. Not abandoned empty, but wrong empty. The interior was pristine, as if no one had ever used it. No sleeping bag, no gear, no signs of habitation. But the tent walls were covered in writing. Benjamin leaned closer, his flashlight beam trembling slightly. The writing was in Japanese. Kanji characters, hundreds of them, covering every inch of fabric in neat, obsessive rows. He didn't read Japanese, but he recognized the repetitive nature of the text. The same characters over and over again, written with what looked like charcoal or dried blood. The cold intensified. Benjamin's breath came out in visible puffs now, despite the October temperature being in the mid-50s. His sensitivity was screaming at him to run, to get back to his truck, to call for help. But he couldn't move. The writing held him transfixed, the characters seeming to shift in his peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into patterns that his conscious mind couldn't quite process, but that some deeper part of him recognized as profoundly wrong. A sound behind him. Footsteps on wet trail. Benjamin spun, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain. Empty trail. Nothing but Douglas firs and western hemlocks and the thick carpet of ferns that covered the forest floor. But he'd heard footsteps, he was certain. The distinctive sound of boots on packed earth and gravel. "Kayla?" His voice came out hoarse. "Kayla Morrison?" The rain answered him, intensifying until it sounded like static, like white noise drowning out everything else. Benjamin backed away from the tent, his flashlight sweeping the trail in wide arcs. Nothing. No one. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, a physical pressure against his skin. He could feel eyes on him, multiple sets of eyes, though when he looked there was nothing to see except trees and rain and darkness. He pulled out his radio. "Fairholme Station. This is Ranger Reeves. I'm on the Spruce Railroad Trail, approximately half-mile from the parking area. I've found an unregistered tent at the Morrison disappearance site. Requesting backup." Static answered him. Pure white noise. No voices. No acknowledgement. Benjamin adjusted the frequency and tried again. More static. The radio was working. He could see the transmission indicator lighting up. But nothing was getting through, or nothing was responding. A figure appeared on the trail ahead. Benjamin's flashlight beam caught her in mid-step. A woman in white, her kimono soaked through and clinging to her skeletal frame, her hair hanging in long black ropes that covered most of her face. She stood absolutely motionless, her bare feet pale against the dark earth of the trail. Benjamin's flashlight fell from his hand. It hit the ground with a plastic crack, the beam swinging wildly before coming to rest, pointing at the forest canopy. In the sudden darkness, he could see the woman more clearly, as if light had been obscuring her rather than revealing her. She was glowing faintly, a phosphorescent pallor that reminded him of bioluminescent fungi. Her hands hung at her sides, fingers too long, too thin. Where her face should be was only hair and a suggestion of features beneath, a mouth slightly open, and eyes that reflected no light at all. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees in an instant. Benjamin's breath crystallized in front of him. Ice formed on the wet fabric of his rain gear, crackling softly. The woman took a step forward, her movement completely silent despite the muddy trail. Then another step. She moved like something that had forgotten how human locomotion worked, her joints bending at wrong angles, her gait too smooth. Benjamin's training finally kicked in. He bent, scooped up his flashlight, and ran. Back toward the parking area, his boots slipping on the wet trail, branches whipping at his face. Behind him he heard nothing. No footsteps pursuing him, no sounds of movement. But the cold followed him, wrapping around him like a living thing. And his sensitivity was howling with terror so primal that conscious thought barely registered. He burst out of the forest into the parking area, gasping for air. His truck sat where he'd left it, water streaming off its hood. Kayla Morrison's Honda was still there too, and standing between the vehicles, illuminated by his flashlight beam, was the woman in white. She hadn't followed him. She'd arrived before him, or had been here all along, waiting. Benjamin scrambled into his truck, slammed the door, locked it. His hands shook so badly he could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. He threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning on the wet pavement, and peeled out onto Route 101. In his rearview mirror, the woman stood in the middle of the parking area, perfectly still, growing smaller as he accelerated away. Her figure remained visible far longer than should have been possible, that faint phosphorescent glow cutting through the rain and darkness. He made it back to Fairholme Station in 15 minutes, the truck fishtailing around corners, speedometer pushing 70 on roads designed for 45. He locked himself inside the station, checked every window, every door. His radio still produced only static. He tried his cell phone, no signal, which wasn't unusual out here, but the timing felt deliberate. He was cut off, alone, with something that couldn't possibly exist, but that he'd seen with absolute clarity. Benjamin's training told him to stay calm, to think rationally, to find a logical explanation. But his sensitivity knew better. Whatever that woman was, she wasn't human, wasn't alive, was something that violated every natural law he'd been taught to believe in. He opened his laptop and pulled up the photograph again. Frame 14, the face between the trees. He zoomed in as far as the resolution allowed. The woman's features were clearer at higher magnification. The same pale skin, the same black hair, the same mouth slightly open, revealing darkness inside. And now that he was looking for it, he could see what he'd missed before. The white fabric of a kimono, barely visible behind the tree trunks. Kayla Morrison had been researching old-growth forests. Benjamin pulled up her research proposal from the case file he'd downloaded earlier. She'd been specifically interested in the ecological history of the Pacific Northwest, particularly the impact of early 20th century Japanese immigration on forest management practices. Her research had focused on the areas around Lake Crescent, where a small Japanese fishing and logging community had existed in the early 1900s before being displaced during World War II. Benjamin opened a new browser window and searched for Japanese fishing community Lake Crescent. The search results loaded slowly over the station's satellite internet connection. Several historical society articles appeared, documenting the settlement that had once existed near what was now the Spruce Railroad Trail. The community had been small, maybe 30 families, but thriving until the internment camps. Everyone had been forced to leave in 1942. Their homes had been burned, their possessions confiscated. Most never returned. One article included photographs. Benjamin scrolled through them. Grainy black and white images of families, fishing boats, simple wooden structures. And then he stopped scrolling. The photograph was dated 1941, taken by a visiting missionary. It showed a group of women in traditional clothing standing near the lakeshore. In the back row, partially obscured by the others, was a young woman in a white kimono. The caption identified her as Emiko Nakamura, age 23, who had died under mysterious circumstances in September 1941, just months before the evacuation. The resemblance to the figure Benjamin had seen on the trail was unmistakable. He clicked on the article about Emiko Nakamura's death. The details were sparse. She'd been found in the forest near what was now the Spruce Railroad Trail, dead of exposure despite the warm September weather. Local authorities had ruled it suicide, but the Japanese community had insisted otherwise. They'd claimed she was murdered, that her death was the result of anti-Japanese sentiment that was already running high before Pearl Harbor. There had been an investigation, but nothing conclusive. Emiko had been buried in a small cemetery that the community maintained, and then a year later everyone had been sent to internment camps, and the cemetery had been abandoned, eventually consumed by the forest as the land returned to federal control. Benjamin sat back in his chair, his mind racing. A Uri. That's what he'd seen. A vengeful spirit from Japanese folklore, the ghost of someone who'd died with extreme trauma or injustice, unable to rest. Uri appeared as they had at death. Emiko's white kimono would have been her funeral clothing. They manifested in places connected to their death or their anguish, and they were known for their obsessive focus on whatever wrong had been done to them. But Yurei were stories, folk tales. They weren't real, except Benjamin had seen her, had felt the cold that accompanied her presence, had experienced the primal terror that his sensitivity recognized as genuine supernatural danger. He looked at the photograph again, frame 14, taken days before Kayla Morrison disappeared. Had Kayla seen the Yurei too? Was that what had happened to her? The research proposal suggested she'd been investigating the old Japanese settlement. She would have found the same historical articles, maybe made the same connections. Had she gone looking for the abandoned cemetery? Had she found something that triggered Emiko's manifestation? Benjamin's radio crackled to life, static at first, then a voice, female speaking Japanese. The words were rapid, urgent, repeating in a loop. He didn't understand the language, but the emotion was clear. Rage, grief, an accusation or a curse, spoken with such venom that the radio speaker distorted, then English breaking through the Japanese. "Help me." Kayla Morrison's voice, distant and hollow. "Please, help me. She won't let me." Static drowned out the rest. Benjamin grabbed the radio. "Kayla? Kayla Morrison, where are you?" The Japanese voice again, louder now, the words bleeding together into a sound that was no longer quite language. The radio speaker started smoking. Benjamin dropped it as the plastic casing cracked, the components inside melting from heat that shouldn't have been possible from a simple battery-powered device. The Japanese voice continued even as the radio died, echoing from the walls of the station, from the windows, from inside Benjamin's own head. The lights went out. Emergency backup should have kicked in immediately, but the station remained dark. Benjamin grabbed his flashlight, but when he pressed the switch, nothing happened. Dead battery. Impossible. He'd checked it an hour ago. He fumbled for his backup light, clicked it on. The beam was weak, barely penetrating the darkness. Something moved past the window. A flash of white fabric, long black hair. Benjamin's sensitivity exploded with warning so intense it was physically painful, like knives scraping along every nerve. She was here. Emiko Nakamura's Yurei had followed him from the trail to the station, and now she was outside, circling, looking for a way in. The temperature inside the station dropped. Benjamin could see his breath. Ice formed on the inside of the windows, crystalline patterns spreading across the glass like fractures. He backed toward the center of the room, his weak flashlight beam darting from window to window. White fabric flashed past each one in turn, impossibly fast movement, or multiple figures, or the same figure existing in multiple places simultaneously. The front door handle turned, slowly, deliberately. Benjamin had locked it. He was certain he'd locked it. But the handle continued turning, the lock mechanism clicking uselessly. The door swung open. Emiko Nakamura stood in the doorway. Her kimono was pristine now, the white fabric glowing with that same phosphorescent light. Her hair hung in perfect black sheets, parted slightly over her face. Benjamin could see her eyes through the gaps, dark pools that reflected his flashlight beam like an animal's eyes catching headlights. Her mouth opened, revealing darkness inside, and she spoke. "Tasukete, help me." But it wasn't her voice. It was Kayla Morrison's voice coming from the Yurei's mouth, distorted and wrong, like audio played through corrupted speakers. Benjamin's training had nothing for this. His rational mind had nothing for this. Only his sensitivity had an answer, and that answer was pure primal terror. But beneath the terror was something else, a strange clarity. The Yurei wasn't here for him. She was here because of Kayla. Because Kayla had disturbed something, discovered something, and now she was trapped. "Where is she?" Benjamin's voice shook. "Where's Kayla Morrison?" Emiko tilted her head at an angle that would have broken a living person's neck. Her mouth moved, but the sound came from everywhere, echoing off the walls. "She sought truth. She found burden. Now she carries what I cannot release." "What burden? What truth?" The Yurei glided forward, her feet not quite touching the floor. Benjamin backed away until he hit the desk. Emiko raised one hand, her fingers too long and too pale and pointed at the laptop. The screen flickered to life despite being closed. It opened on its own, the display showing not the desktop but photographs, dozens of them, hundreds, scrolling rapidly, all showing the same scene from different angles. A grave, overgrown and forgotten, marked with a simple wooden post. "He burned the truth," Emiko's voice said through Kayla's throat. "He buried the lie. She dug too deep." The photograph stopped scrolling, freezing on a single image. The grave marker was visible now, the kanji carved into the wood still legible despite decades of weathering. Benjamin couldn't read it, but the date was clear. September 1941. Emiko Nakamura's grave. The screen changed. New photographs now, recent ones, clearly taken by Kayla Morrison on her digital camera. They showed the same grave excavated, the wooden marker lying beside a disturbed patch of earth, and in the hole where the grave should have been, nothing. Empty earth, no bones, no evidence of burial. The grave was false. "He told them suicide," Emiko said. "He told them shame. He buried nothing. He hid everything." Benjamin understood. Emiko Nakamura hadn't committed suicide. She'd been murdered, and whoever killed her had claimed she'd buried herself in shame when in reality there had been no burial at all. Her body had been hidden somewhere else, her grave a lie, and the truth had been lost when the Japanese community was forced into internment camps. Everyone who'd known the truth had been scattered or silenced. For 70 years, Emiko's yurei had remained unable to rest because she'd never been properly mourned, never been given the rights that her culture demanded. And Kayla Morrison had found the empty grave, had disturbed it, had triggered something. "Where is Kayla?" Benjamin asked again. Emiko's figure began to flicker like a corrupted video signal. Behind her, the doorway showed not the parking area but something else. A forest that looked almost but not quite like the Olympic rainforest. The trees were too dense, the darkness too complete. And hanging from the branches were strips of white fabric, hundreds of them, like prayer papers or funeral markers. "She walks where I walk," Emiko said. "She sees what I see. She cannot leave until I can leave. You understand, you feel?" His sensitivity. She was talking about his sensitivity. She knew he could feel the wrongness, could perceive what others couldn't. That's why she'd appeared in his photograph. Why she'd led him here. She needed someone who could bridge both worlds, the rational and the supernatural. "How do I help her?" Benjamin asked. "How do I help both of you?" "Find the bones." Emiko's voice was fading, becoming harder to hear over a sound like wind through trees. "Give them proper rest, tell the truth, let me go." "Where are the bones?" The yurei's mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, revealing not darkness now but a glimpse of that other forest, the one behind her in the doorway. And hanging from a Sitka spruce in that impossible forest was Kayla Morrison, suspended by strips of white fabric, her eyes open but unseeing, trapped in the same liminal space where Emiko's spirit remained bound. "Where he left me," Emiko whispered. "Where the water turns black and nothing grows." The yurei vanished. The lights in the station flickered back on. The temperature rose to normal. Benjamin stood alone in the middle of the room, his heart hammering, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the desk to stay upright. The laptop screen showed only the desktop now, the photographs gone. But they'd been real. He'd seen them. More importantly, his sensitivity had recognized their truth, where the water turns black and nothing grows. Benjamin pulled up a topographic map of the Olympic National Park on his laptop. Lake Crescent was oligotrophic, exceptionally clear and pure, fed by snowmelt and springs. But there were a few places where the water darkened, where the depth increased suddenly, and the bottom dropped away into cold thermoclines where no plants could survive. One such place was the Devil's Punch Bowl, a deep spot on the northern shore not far from where the Spruce Railroad Trail ran. The historical articles had mentioned the Japanese settlement was near there. Before the trail existed, before the railroad, there had been fishing camps along that stretch of shore. The Devil's Punch Bowl would have been known to the community, a dangerous spot where several drownings had occurred over the years. Benjamin grabbed his rain gear and his emergency kit. He took a coil of rope from the supply closet, a waterproof flashlight, and his diving mask from the search and rescue equipment locker. The rational part of his mind told him this was insane, that he should wait for morning, call for backup, let professionals handle it. But he knew with absolute certainty that morning would be too late. Kayla Morrison was trapped in whatever liminal space Emiko's Ure inhabited, and every moment he delayed pushed her further from the world of the living. The rain had lightened to a drizzle when he reached the Devil's Punch Bowl access point, a narrow trail that branched off from the Spruce Railroad Trail and wound down to the lake shore. The water was black under the overcast sky, lapping gently against the rocks. Benjamin could see why the place had earned its name. The shore dropped off sharply here, the water deepening from ankle deep to over 100 feet within just a few yards of the beach. He secured the rope to a sturdy Sitka spruce and tied the other end around his waist. The water would be cold, probably 50 degrees even in October, but he'd searched these waters before in winter conditions. He could handle it. He had to handle it. Benjamin waded into the lake, the cold biting through his waterproof gear. The bottom disappeared beneath him after just 3 steps, and suddenly he was swimming, the rope playing out behind him. He dove, pulling himself down hand over hand along the rope, his flashlight cutting through the murky water. The lake bottom here was a jumble of boulders and sunken logs, creating caves and crevices where light rarely penetrated. His flashlight beam caught something white. Benjamin pulled himself closer. Bones. A skull wedged between 2 rocks. The rest of the skeleton scattered by decades of water movement. And wrapped around the bones, twisted through the rib cage and around the femurs, were strips of white fabric, the remains of a kimono, preserved by the cold, dark water. Emiko Nakamura. Murdered and dumped in the lake 70 years ago, hidden where no one from her community would find her, her grave on land a false marker planted to disguise the crime. Benjamin's lungs were burning. He grabbed the skull carefully, reverently, and kicked toward the surface. He breached gasping, the cold water streaming off his face. The shore was maybe 20 feet away. He swam for it, the skull cradled against his chest, the rope guiding him back. He collapsed on the rocky beach, shivering violently. The skull rested beside him, empty eye sockets staring at the sky. Benjamin pulled out his radio. Miraculously, it worked now. The earlier damage somehow reversed. "This is Ranger Reeves. I need Sayar at the Devil's Punch Bowl. I've found human remains, and I need someone to search for a missing person who may be in critical condition." The response was immediate. Help was coming. Benjamin looked at the skull and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry no one found you sooner." The air around him changed. Not cold this time, but warm. A presence that his sensitivity registered not as threat, but as release. Emiko Nakamura's Ure appeared one final time, standing at the water's edge. But she looked different now, younger, her expression peaceful rather than anguished. She bowed deeply, the gesture full of gratitude and relief. Then she turned and walked into the forest, her figure fading with each step until she was gone. The forest lightened, literally lightened, as if a shadow that had been hanging over this stretch of shoreline for 7 decades had finally lifted. Benjamin could hear birds singing. He hadn't even realized they'd been silent. The morning sun broke through the clouds, turning the water of Lake Crescent from black to its usual crystalline blue. SAR arrived within 40 minutes. They found Kayla Morrison half a mile from the Devil's Punch Bowl, unconscious but alive, suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration. She'd been missing for 8 days, but she looked like she'd been wandering for weeks. Her field notes, recovered from her backpack, documented her discovery of the empty grave and her theories about what had happened to Emiko Nakamura. The last entry was dated October 6th, the day she'd disappeared. "Something is watching me. Something in white. I can hear her crying." Kayla recovered in Seattle after 2 weeks in the hospital. She had no memory of the 8 days she'd been missing, just fragmented images of a dark forest and a woman in white who kept showing her things. Photographs, memories, truths that needed to be witnessed. The doctors attributed her survival to luck and the relatively mild October weather. Benjamin knew better. The remains from the Devil's Punch Bowl were identified through dental records as Emiko Nakamura. The FBI opened a cold case investigation into her death, though the murderer, if he'd ever existed, was long dead himself. Emiko's bones were returned to her surviving family in California, descendants of her brother who'd gone to the internment camps and never returned to Washington. She was given proper funeral rites according to her family's Buddhist traditions and cremated, her ashes scattered in the ocean according to her brother's wishes. Benjamin wrote a detailed report about finding the remains, carefully omitting any mention of Uri or supernatural manifestations. He stuck to the facts that could be verified, the historical research that had led him to search the Devil's Punch Bowl, the evidence of an old crime, the successful recovery of a missing person. His supervisors praised his dedication and intuition. The Seattle Times ran a story about the ranger who'd solved a 70-year-old murder and saved a missing hiker's life. But Benjamin knew the truth. He'd learned that his sensitivity wasn't a curse or a malfunction, but a real perception of genuine phenomena that existed outside the boundaries of scientific rationalism. The walls he'd built to suppress that sensitivity crumbled completely during those hours at the Devil's Punch Bowl, and he'd never been able to rebuild them. Now he felt everything, every cold spot, every place where the boundary between worlds wore thin, every presence that wasn't quite human. He transferred to a different park 6 months later, unable to shake the feeling that the forests around Lake Crescent were watching him, waiting to see if he'd help the next spirit that needed release. His last night at the Fairholme station, he found a photograph slipped under his door. He didn't remember taking it, didn't recognize the location, but in the center of the image, barely visible between two trees, was a figure. Not Emiko Nakamura this time. Someone else. Another face that needed to be found. Another truth that needed to be told. Benjamin looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he filed it carefully in his desk drawer, knowing he'd never stop searching for the stories hidden in the dark places. His sensitivity had made him vulnerable, but it had also made him necessary. Some debts could only be paid by those who could perceive them, and some truths could only be uncovered by people willing to acknowledge that reality was far stranger and more terrible than rational minds wanted to admit. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.